Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Hypertrophy Past and Present. And actually, you know what, Chris? I haven't told you this. When I uploaded our last episode, I looked at where viewers or listeners were located. And you guys who are listening are located in over 100 different countries. So wherever you're listening, welcome and thank you for joining us. So as always, I'll be introducing us to another old school plan in a moment, doing the past part of the podcast. And then Chris, you'll be introducing us to a new topic later today on the present part of the podcast. Is there anything you want to jump in and lead with today?
No, I'm good. I'm looking forward to hearing about this this strength training program from the past. Is it Reg Park that we've got today?
It is Reg Park. So last week we spoke about Steve Reeves, and today we've got Reg Park. So we've got two of the great Mr. Universes back to back. And last week I said that the Steve Reeves plan we were talking about was my personal favorite Silver Era plan. And I made a comment that there was one other that I really liked. And this is one of those. So Reg Park, obviously, I say obviously, but maybe you don't know, he published quite a lot of different plans. And people will know Reg mostly for his 5x5. And we're going to talk about a variant of that in a moment. But contrary to how the Steve Reeves plan looked last week, Reg used less exercise variation and he used multiple sets per exercise. So I personally love that combination of combining kind of what Steve did with what Reg did. But let me introduce you guys to this particular Reg plan and then we can talk about it. So this one, like I said, he had a lot of different plans, and this was what he called the Mr. Universe bulk course. Now, bulk is a word like we kind of colloquially use it a little bit today, and you talk about bulking and that's sort of associated more with kind of like a dirty bulk and just weight gaining. And they used it a little bit like that, but there seemed to be a slightly different nuance to the way that they were using it back then. It was very, very common. Very commonly where they talk about their bulking routines, and their bulking routines tended to be more like their weight gain. It was kind of like you had someone who needed to gain muscle mass and you would do a bulk routine. And then after you've gained a considerable amount of muscle mass, then you might look at, definition or they would call it defining, I think, workouts where, you might sort of isolate muscles or whatever to get into like show, not just conditioning, but to, I guess, maximally develop particular muscles. So this bulk course is a little bit more of, I guess, what we would call a mass gaining course or program. So I'll just read through it and then I'll make a couple. Actually, I'll tell you guys first kind of the instructions for it and then I'll read through the exercises. So he made it very clear. And actually, I want to make a point about this as well. When you look at a lot of these plans, I don't know if you've noticed this so far, Chris, but a lot of the time there's a little bit of like almost vagueness in the way that they give instructions. So they talk about reps or they talk about sets, and it's kind of like sort of do something like this. And they kind of give people a few options. And Reg sort of did this as well. So he would say, never train more than 3 times a week. And it's like, well, does that mean always train 3 times a week? Or does it mean maybe you can do 2 as well? Like it's a little bit vague, but he goes, never do more than 3 times a week. Okay. And then he kind of talked about ramping up volume. So he would say perform. So in the first week, I think he actually said start with 1 set and the next week go to 2 sets, but it was sort of a gradual increase over the first couple of weeks. And then he said for 1 month, you can do 3 sets per exercise. For the next month, you're going to do 4 sets. And then for the next month, you're going to do 5 sets. So that sounds a lot. We're not talking warm-up sets here. We're talking actual work sets. So worked up to 5 sets per exercise. And again, he made this very clear. He said, you're never going to do more than 5 sets. Do not do more than 5, and do not do 5 sets for more than a month, he said. Now, one other sort of somewhat vague instruction that he gave is with the repetitions, he said, never do more than X. And I'll tell you what that number is for each exercise. But it was a little bit like, do you do a couple less? Do you do a double progression method? I assume he was suggesting you do a double progression method. So the first exercise was a barbell squat. So again, you would do 3 sets for the first month, 4 for the second, 5 for the third, and you do your sets, and he would say, never do above 5 repetitions. And the instruction was once you can do all of those sets with the 5 repetitions, then you go heavier. Now, to me, that's suggesting when you go heavier, you're probably going to drop the repetitions and you're probably going to drop down to 3 repetitions or so. So I'm assuming that that's what the indication was there, but it was very much don't go above 5. So we've got the barbell squat. Now, this was supersetted with the breathing pullover. And I believe we've talked about the pullover. We've touched on it briefly in the past. We might touch on it again in a moment. But that was for a set of 10. Now, typically with that, you wouldn't go overly heavy. It was not really like a go to failure type exercise. And you would do that immediately after the squat. Then he moved into wide grip bench press, and it was very specific. It had to be wide grip. And again, this was never more than 5 repetitions. And in fact, elsewhere, he actually talks about doing this for as few as 2 repetitions. And then you go into what I believe he calls it a power deadlift, which is basically like a rack pull, so a knee height rack pull. And at the top of the lift, you do a shrug with it. And again, this was sets of 5, never going above 5. And then he, after that, would do a barbell vertical shrug. Now, with this, he would recommend doing as many reps as possible with your max deadlift weight. Now, here he actually said never go above 20. I've never tried doing vertical shrugs on my max deadlift weight, so I don't have a ballpark for how many one is likely to do. But he did say don't go above 20 with that one. And then we've got a wide grip bent over barbell row. Again, never going above 5. And finally, we have an exercise which I've actually been using a little bit more of in my training groups, which is a barbell cheating curl. And it's quite an interesting exercise. If you guys haven't done it, it's basically just a looser form barbell curl, like exactly what it sounds like. You use a little bit of hip involvement in it. And he was doing this very heavy. He was also doing this for no more than 5 repetitions. So very heavy loads. What do you make of all of that?
So there's quite a few things that we can say here. I mean, it's really interesting to look at this program in comparison with the Steve Reeves program that we looked at previously, because we're kind of going from one extreme to the other. You know, we had a program that had an enormous amount of exercise variety in, with pretty much, you know, full coverage for every muscle region that you can think of, with one or two minor exceptions. And then we look at this and we're like, wow, this is so different. This is much more minimalist, and I can see some really big holes in this routine. You know, there's a lot not here. I mean, straight away, you know, we're very limited on the amount of work. I mean, I know I kind of make this point all the time, but, you know, I'm just seeing here that we've got a row, which is wide grip. Well, okay, so where's the lat work then? So I've got no narrow grip, no sagittal plane pulling, and I've got no frontal plane pulling. So there's not even a pull-up in here. You know, you could radically improve this program just by putting a pull-up in it. That's that. And this is the point I've made multiple times when we've been looking at these routines. Like, pull-ups are not difficult to set up. You know, this is not an equipment issue really. So it seems to be a huge kind of failing, in my opinion, of many of these older routines, that they just don't think in terms of that frontal plane pulling, which would
there are some that really
this program.
Emphasized the frontal plane pull up or pull down. So I'll bring one for you soon, just to alleviate some of this anxiety over the lack of lats.
It's not an anxiety, it's just noticing a trend, you know. But here, there's no lat training at all, really, unless you put the pullover into the lat category, and it's a very kind of limited lat exercise. But yeah, so essentially, we've got the pullover as really the only thing that gets close to touching the lat, and obviously the back work is very transverse plane focused. Also, this is a big shift away from the very early programs. I think did we start out with Sandow? We did, didn't we?
We started out with a Milo Barbell Company.
Milo Barbell Company.
Which was kind of like the bridge between Sandow and,
But we were modeling on kind of the Sandow heritage. So that focus on overhead pressing was really big when we first looked at the early routines, and now it's gone, you know. So like, we've got kind of 2 shrug exercises in here, you know, but we've got literally no overhead pressing at all. So again, it's really interesting to see these changes in the focus of the exercises they're doing. So I think that the lack of sort of lat work, like a frontal or sagittal plane pulling, I mean, you can argue that the pullover does that, but it's so far outside the range of motion where the lats are, you know, got leverage, it doesn't really count, in my opinion. And then the lack of overhead pressing, again, I think is a really interesting omission. But again, like I mentioned in some of the early routines, there was a lack of deadlift variation when you could, again, say, look, you know, it's not difficult. If you've got a barbell, you can pick it up off the ground. So why haven't we got deadlift variations making a bigger impact in those early programs? And we just didn't see that. And now we see it, you know, and a rack pull's a really interesting kind of choice to sort of shift focus and work on different muscle groups. So Again, very, very interesting just to see the sort of diverse choices that are going on here in terms of exercise selection. So I think that would probably be my sort of immediate observations. I mean, those are observations, obviously ignoring the stuff that I will say every time, which is obviously we haven't got the equipment, so we can't do, rectus femoris training with knee extensions. We can't do hamstrings training with leg curls because those kind of things didn't necessarily exist. So you can't really argue that that's a failing because there's just no real meaningful way to do that, obviously. But yeah, those would be my initial impressions just on the exercise selection side of things.
What do you make of the pullover? I know you briefly touched on it potentially being a little bit of Latin, but obviously not the most ideal exercise. A lot of these guys did include this as part of their squat routine. They would do the squat with a pullover, and they did talk about it more from a rib cage chest perspective. Do you have any thoughts on that, or do you think this is just something weird that kind of got grandfathered in and people followed it?
Well, essentially, that if you're doing a pullover where in the way that they would have done, I imagine, which is where you're using a standard weight like a barbell or an easy bar, and basically your peak external moment arm is in the most extended position, the most stretched position of the movement. Okay. Now, if you're doing it that way, it's basically going to be a costal pec exercise with, some posterior delt there, to help you. So I think it's valid to categorize it in that way. I don't think I would categorize it as a lat exercise first and foremost. I think I would probably categorize it. I've talked around this issue many, many times before, but it is kind of a mixed bag. You've got lots of stuff going on, but I think arguably the costal pec is probably the kind of the key factor there. So I would agree with them. I would say, if you're treating that as a chest exercise, that's not wrong. Absolutely. Obviously, it's not going to be going anywhere close to the upper parts of the pec because those are shoulder flexors rather than shoulder extensors.
Well, it's interesting because they talk about it very much as like an expansion exercise. The goal here is to make the chest large, and I don't just mean, obviously the bench was the main mass builder, but it was that very iconic, like if you guys look up photos of Reg Park, like you'll see just how well developed and large his chest was. And they're talking about it from that perspective of literally like it's expanding the rib cage, it's expanding the chest. And it's interesting you're saying, it's more kind of lower chest, which I guess is somewhat neglected a lot of the time. Potentially it would have that aesthetic kind of impact.
Yeah, and it's again, like you say, aesthetic choices probably play into this. So like we talked at the beginning of this series of podcasts that we did about the aesthetic choices of people from the Sandow kind of heritage, where they were thinking mainly about the overhead pressing, producing that sort of deltoid development and not really wanting chest development at all. And you can see that. I mean, just look at the photos of those guys. You can see that. And as you say, you look perhaps at the photos of this group of bodybuilders, and you can see that the chest development is very much marked by comparison. Is that the pullover doing that? Is that the bench press doing that? I mean, obviously the bench press again was something that we tended to not see in those early training programs. So there's different things going on. But yeah, I mean, obviously it's designed to be a minimalist program. So I don't want to just kind of stand here and poke holes in it and go, they don't have this exercise and they don't have that exercise. Well, yeah, of course they don't, because it's designed to be a minimalist program. But for me, there's just that couple of things that I really don't understand why they didn't have them in there.
Yeah. And they do often talk about these bulking type routines, essentially being minimalist. They call them like abbreviated type plans, where they are intentionally reducing the amount of exercises for the sake of just gaining as much mass as possible. And then they add these exercises back in, which is probably why they talk about not doing this for more than, 12 weeks or however long. I will show you a Reg Park workout in a future episode, which is hopefully a little bit more to your liking as far as exercise selection goes. But what I found particularly interesting about this one was these are pretty high volume per exercise. So he's going up to 5 sets per exercise and suggesting that you can do this Monday, Wednesday, Friday, your typical kind of 48-hour sort of part per workout. Now, for you guys who've listened to our content, you probably know that generally speaking, we would say that probably that 3 sets per 48 hours is kind of the sweet spot for recovery. So how is it that in the Silva era where, before steroids, people were presumably doing 4-5 sets and, seem to be getting good results?
Yeah, so I think we've got two observations to make on that point. Firstly is the one where you described in your kind of introductory instructions that he provides. So he's saying you don't do, the 5 sets for more than 1 month. So he's already he's kind of accepting or taking into account, acknowledging is kind of the word I'm going for. He's acknowledging that you can't just run this indefinitely, which is kind of indicating that they know that some post-workout fatigue is going to accumulate. So I think we can kind of straight away just point out that there's this recognition that this is not a sustainable state. So I think that's a really good observation from them to say that, you start pushing higher than, 3 or 4 sets per muscle group per workout 3 times a week, and you're going to run into this fatigue accumulation problem. The second thing is, of course, that we're dealing here with heavy loads, more or less. So he's kind of working with, sort of 3, 4, 5 repetitions per set. And as you said, even going down as low as 2 in certain cases like the bench press. Now, that's really interesting. So in terms of post-workout recovery, is really, really good for the classic strength training range of about 6 to 10 reps per set. So if you want to draw a graph, and I've done my own version of this, but you can collect all of the data in either untrained or trained people. I've done a chart in strength trained people of all the studies I could find where they measured post-workout recovery after doing sets to failure or close to failure with 6 to 10 repetitions per set. And essentially you can graph the amount of volume that you can do and recover in a certain period of time. And that's where we get this kind of, 3 sets is recoverable within 48 hours, 5 sets is recoverable within 72 hours, and so on and so on. So there's a huge amount of data available for that, and it's really well established. You can kind of do the analysis yourself. If you try and do the same analysis with heavy loads, the wheels come off. You just can't do it, because what you find, and I did this as a table, I couldn't do it as a chart because there's not enough granularity in the data to do it. Because what you find is that basically pretty much any number of sets of singles, doubles, triples, or even up to, kind of getting close to 5 repetitions per set, anything you do in that is recoverable within sort of 48 hours. You can't really do enough sets to really see a significant kind of effect of fatigue at the 48-hour point. You can see it at 24 hours and higher numbers of sets, but you don't really see it at the 48-hour marker. Not always, not very often anyway. And that's really, really interesting. So basically what we're seeing is this massive difference between the post-workout fatigue created by moderate loads and post-workout fatigue created by heavy loads. Heavy, I mean up to sort of 5 repetitions per set. Now, just to kind of finalize this observation that I'm kind of presenting here, if we now look at lighter loads, so off the top end of the sort of 15 rep maxes that you kind of say is the top end of the moderate load rep range between 6 and 15, if you go off the top end of that and you start doing sets with lighter loads, you're going to find that a single set of light loads to failure is going to give you 48, 72 hours worth of fatigue. It's absolutely nuts. So there's this perception, I think, in the fitness industry as a whole. Obviously, we're kind of, if you think about the fitness industry as a gigantic kind of pyramid, we're kind of this tiny little triangle at the top that talks about the scientific bits, and the majority of the fitness industry is just people who want to be motivated to exercise, and of course that's the majority of this pyramid. But if you look at this majority of the pyramid, most people would just kind of go, well, heavy loads take longer to recover because. But the reality is the opposite. So what we see is an incredibly strong trend for being able to do quite high numbers of sets of singles, doubles, triples, and not actually see any post-workout fatigue at, say, 24, 48 hours. And you start increasing the rep ranges, you immediately start seeing that post-workout fatigue, and you get as high as lighter loads, and absolutely, the wheels come off. You can't actually do light load strength training to failure with singles, even with single sets, 3 times a week. Fatigue is going to be there every time you come back, and that's going to then create accumulated fatigue problems. So we're seeing this very strong, observable trend for rep range to have an enormous impact on post-workout fatigue.
This is really significant, and so I do actually want to go over some of it again, because it will be new to a lot of people, I think, who are listening to this. So you've made that obvious statement there that, a lot of people do believe that actually this post-workout fatigue is worse or higher with heavier loads and low repetitions. And, that was a mantra that I heard all the time as an early PT, heavy loads cause CNS fatigue. That was just what people said, and no one really questioned that. And ultimately what you said there is there's there's very, very high ceiling, if anything, to how many sets you can do of very heavy loads. If you're doing singles, I mean, there's in the table that you put out there was a study where they used, 20 sets of singles?
Yeah. So just to be clear for people who are struggling to understand that table, when researchers test things like that, you don't obviously expect your subjects to lift their 1 rep max 20 times. I mean, I don't think I've lifted a 1 rep max 20 times in my life. So nobody's going to do that, in a single workout. What happens is they do a sort of their initial estimated 1 rep max, and then the researchers will reduce the weight slightly based on the rest period that they're going to have and what they think the likely 1 rep max will be in the next attempts. They kind of drop the weight by, sort of 5% or so, and then you do it again, and then you drop the weight by a bit more and you do it again. So you end up with these 20 singles. No, they're not 21 rep maxes, but at the point when the attempt was made, it's kind of pretty much the maximum weight that they could lift. Now, even with that scenario going on, as you say, you don't really get any post-workout fatigue. And this is a really perfect moment for me to just add in a quick observation on what fatigue actually is. And I'm not going to run for, kind of 10, 20 minutes here. I just want to make a very quick observation, which is that when we say fatigue in exercise science, what we mean is that there is a temporary period of time in which exercise performance is reduced. And you can see that in the workout itself, like what I've just described. So they do the 20 singles and exercise performance drops, and you have to reduce the weight in order to be able to do your next single. Okay, so we're seeing fatigue happening during the workout. Fatigue is the temporary reduction in exercise performance. It is a measurable outcome. It's not anything physiologically kind of defined, as in we can't say what the mechanisms are unless we kind of drill into that and start investigating, but it is the outcome. It is the measurable reduction in strength. If I come back the following day and I measure again my strength and it's reduced slightly, then I can say that there is fatigue present. Now, if I come back the following day, and this is the point I want to make, if I come back the following day after that workout, after that 20 singles, which honestly I would be very unhappy about doing, if I did that 20 singles and came back the following day and discovered that actually, like many of the subjects in this study, there was no reduction in strength at 24 hours, then I am not fatigued. I'm going to say that again. If I've done that 20 singles and I come back the following day and I'm still capable of producing the same amount of force I was the previous day, I'm not fatigued. Now, I might feel miserable. I might ache. I might be in extreme discomfort. I might dread the thought of going near a barbell again. I might feel all kinds of emotions and feelings associated with the workout that I did the previous day, including up to hating the people who maybe do it. But I'm not fatigued. And this is the thing that I really want to emphasize, that when exercise scientists use the word fatigue, they're referring to an objective reduction in exercise performance. They're not referring to how you feel. Yes, when we start drilling into mechanisms and we talk about, central nervous system fatigue at the supraspinal level, yes, that's absolutely related to, feelings and emotions and those kind of things. And that can create a reduction in strength. But if it doesn't, then technically fatigue is not present. And I think this really is one of those things, again, I say this all the time, and there's so many of these things that I could just do. But if I literally just said that for the rest of my time in the fitness industry, it wouldn't be a waste of time, because everybody in the fitness industry thinks fatigue is a feeling, it's an emotion, it's a sensation, it's this kind of state that kind of creates problems, and nobody really knows what it is. And that's why we've got these ridiculous things being said by, some people in the fitness industry, in our section of the fitness industry, the bit that talks about the science and things like that. You've got people saying, well, fatigue doesn't affect your ability to stimulate adaptations. I'm like, sorry, what? If you have a reduction in exercise performance and that's caused by a reduction in recruitment or mechanical tension, then it has to affect your ability to stimulate adaptations, because those are the two things that stimulate the adaptation, or at least in hypertrophy terms. So again, there's just massive confusion about what fatigue actually is. And so really, I just wanted to emphasize that fatigue is the objective reduction in performance. So yes, if we have a workout comprising 20 singles, starting with 1 rep max and decreasing downwards as required to complete the workout, and you come back the following day and there's no reduction in strength present as a result of that previous day's workout, no, we are not fatigued. The subject is not fatigued. And that's the really interesting thing that we're addressing here.
Yeah, there's lots of really good things there. And I think you've touched on probably why this myth has been perpetuated as to what fatigue is because people are just simply associated with the feeling. And like you said, you could do those 20 singles, you could come back feeling like, absolutely awful, not wanting to touch a barbell, but you may not be fatigued. And so you could do these 20 singles, not be fatigued by the following day, or certainly by 2 days, but in that study, the following day. And then and we're not even talking, 20 singles of a barbell curl. I mean, we're talking like compound lifts, squats. And yet you could do a single set of 20, 25 repetitions in a leg extension and still be fatigued days later.
Absolutely. And that's the issue, because that then requires us to say, well, what's happening then? Why is this happening in this particular way? And so that requires us to then say, well, what is the underlying physiological state that we need to investigate to understand post-workout fatigue? And ultimately what it comes back to, and I posted about this very recently, I did a slide deck where I showed people that post-workout fatigue is not actually primarily happening during the workout. It's actually a process that we undergo in the post-workout periods.
In case people have missed it, could you just quickly cover again? So we've said sort of singles, you could do 15, 20 sets and be recovered. And then you said in that graph that you've put together 6 to 10 repetitions. And then you said that these high repetitions, 15, 20 plus, they're obviously more fatiguing still. Can you just quickly cover that sort of continuum? Where do we see these significant steps up in post-workout fatigue?
Sure. So this is really, really interesting. And this is something that is becoming more obvious the more time I think we spend looking at this data. The more we look at these groups of studies and go, okay, what's happening here? So basically, we can start with those 3 categories, the 1 to 5, 6 to 15, and then 16 plus. And exactly as you just summarized, we've got very little post-workout fatigue happening in the heavy group, moderate amount happening in the moderate group, and then just silly amounts in the light load group. Also, if we drill down within those categories, especially when we're looking at the heavy end of the spectrum, we can do the same thing again. So like the example of the 20 singles, there's just no fatigue happening at all in the post-workout period. But when you start to get up to even 8 to 10 sets of, sort of the kind of the 3, 4, 5 repetitions per set, then suddenly it starts to display fatigue at 24 and even 36. And then if you push it up to this, I think there's one of the studies I've got on my list is sort of brushing the 6 rep max mark, then you start to see 48 hours as well, maybe, and in certain cases. Interestingly, I think that 6 rep actually was only 36 hours. But the interesting thing about that 6 rep max study is that they did have a much more granular measurement of post-workout fatigue. So they took multiple measurements over the period they were measuring, not just at 24, 48, whatever. And that showed a secondary muscle damage effect. So we'll get into that in a minute when we talk about what post-workout fatigue actually looks like. But when you see something like a secondary post-workout fatigue effect, where you get that initial strength loss as a result of the workout, and then you come back 4, 8, 10, 12 hours later and it's dropped again, a secondary reduction in strength, that tells you've got an inflammatory process going on, which is part of the key kind of post-workout effect. So in answer to your question, what we see not only is differences between heavy, moderate and light loads, but we also see differences within those rep ranges. So it's a sliding scale all the way through.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really interesting thing, which is that if you're working with singles, doubles, triples, which is kind of how Olympic weightlifting is constructed, if you're working in those rep ranges, then they can literally just train every day and bash out a whole bunch of singles and doubles and come back the following day and do it again. And that's why it works, because ultimately those kind of repetition ranges just don't really cause much post-workout fatigue. And if you're managing that kind of other side of the problem, which is, hating the barbell and not wanting to do that and it hurting. And if you've got the resilience to those issues, for whatever reason, maybe you're just constructed in a way that biomechanically means that you can squat perfectly with absolutely no, kind of discomforting sensations or problems or any other soft tissue issues, then fine. I mean, you can basically do that forever. Well, not forever, but you get the idea. As soon as you start to push up towards that top end of that racket and you're doing 4s and 5s and 6s, well, that's then a very different category. So I think we do see a difference in the 1 to 3 from the sort of the 4 to 6.
I want to make one observation based off that. So in the program we just talked about, the Reg Park one, he actually wrote a secondary program for people who wanted to do weightlifting instead of bodybuilding. And it was very much the same kind of thing, but he made a few exercise substitutions and he added in several additional exercises. So it was actually more volume per muscle, but they were doing triples instead of 5s. And that's interesting what you've just said there, that if you drop down to triples, there's a much higher ceiling, and that actually followed exactly what we saw in that program.
Exactly. And, we obviously probably would consider Doug Hepburn's programs to be a little bit outside of our focus on this podcast, but you look back at those and you're sort of doing 8 sets of 2 and 3. That, I think, really is one of those sweet spots where you get an enormous amount of work done, tremendous strength gains, very effective hypertrophy. I personally ran that program for about 2 years. I absolutely loved it. I only really kind of struggled with, because I was probably at the older end of the spectrum of the kind of people who'd be doing that program, but I only really found it was just occasionally I would get a discomfort, maybe hip pain doing squats or something like that. Never really have any issues with fatigue, always making progress. So personally, I really kind of found those programs to be very, very effective for what they were trying to do. So yeah, I think, again, what we've got is not just differences between these categories of rep ranges, but also within the category. And it's actually quite a steep curve, like we've just been saying. The curve going from the singles, doubles, triples up to the 4, 5s and 6s is a very, very big shift.
So singles, doubles, triples, 8+ sets, 4s and 5s in a 48-hour recovery period. 4s and 5s, 4 or 5 sets, thereabouts?
I think that's probably right, and that would fit perfectly with what Reg Park was doing. I think probably that's true. I think 5 sets of 5 is probably toppy. And again, but we have to stop and just remember that that's not 5 sets of 5 all the time. Yep. That's 5 sets of probably a bunch of 3s, some 4s, and the 5 here and there. And so maybe you start out and you get 5 on your first set, but maybe you do 4 and then 3 and then 3, what have you. It's not actually spending the whole time doing 5s. You've got maybe just 1 or 2 weeks here and there where you've got 5s.
And then 6s, 7s, 8s.
I think we're pushing into the moderate load spectrum there. I think you're starting to get to the zone where realistically, where I would be always trying to keep 3 sets as my target. I think ultimately, we have to remember that, across, and this is something we were talking about before we started this podcast, actually, on a completely separate topic, which I won't raise here because it's an entirely different kind of problem. That when we use statistical significance to identify the presence of a particular phenomenon, we've got to bear in mind that we're using that in the context of our measurement accuracy levels. So we're only going to find stuff if it's really, really obvious. So I think when we're talking about post-workout fatigue, we have to remember that when we're using statistical significance to identify the presence of something, that's when it's really screamingly obviously there. That kind of tells you, if you just kind of extrapolate logically without getting emotionally attached to how statistical significance works, if you just extrapolate logically, that implies that we're probably missing the presence of post-workout fatigue in a lot of other situations. So I'm not trying to kind of, a lot of people say that I overestimate how important fatigue is. I absolutely don't. But I'm just kind of pointing out here that there will be scenarios where we can say, well, statistically, there's no fatigue there. Well, I'm like, I bet there is, though. I bet there is some. I bet there's a tail end of some there. So realistically, yes, if you're doing 3 sets of, say, 5, 6, 7, you're probably going to find that there's a lot less likelihood of post-workout fatigue being present in comparison with somebody who's doing the top end of that range, 8, 9, and 10, higher than that, 12s, whatever. Absolutely. But I would still probably say that my limit is probably 3 sets. Realistic, kind of sensible limit is probably 3 sets for that zone. So yeah, I think you could probably go up to 5 sets when you're going below 5 all the time. I think if you're going above 5, like I tend to train above 5 a lot because it's just convenient to do so. But, I think if you're doing that, I think I would still stick with the 3 sets in the same way that, because it technically is a moderate load at that point. So.
And when do you think you would have to drop down to 2 sets?
So the chances are, I've never thought about that question. The chances are that if you're training all the time in the rep range between 10 and 15, and you're pushing the higher end of that spectrum, then I would imagine that you're probably going to need to ameliorate your 3-set standard that I would say is a moderate low standard. If you're always training that 10 to 15 rep max range, I would say probably want to be on 2 instead of 3 sets. I just don't understand why you would train in that rep range when you can probably just as easily train in the 6 to 10. Maybe there are certain practical situations where people just go, well, I'm so strong and this exercise is the only one I've got. Okay, fine. Okay, well, I understand that. But
I think practicality is a good argument there.
Exactly.
I do use that rep range for some exercises, and it's almost always practicality.
Exactly. but you're like 8 feet tall. So, that's the advantage of being a small guy. So, I think, in 10 to 15, I would say if they're in that range, then I'd probably drop from 3 down to 2. Above 15, obviously, it's just not going to work. You're not going to be able to train 3 times a week with any number of sets per workout if you're in the above 15.
I think that was really interesting. Hopefully people have enjoyed that. I derailed you. You wanted to talk about fatigue mechanisms, so I'll let you go now.
Sure. So people are going to be really sick of me talking by the end of this podcast. So basically, I just wanted to take 5-10 minutes to walk through exactly what is happening in the post-workout period and why these rep ranges produce the effects that they do. So essentially, very quickly as a preamble, there is a kind of, again, in the fitness industry as a whole, there's a perception that post-workout fatigue is produced by muscle damage, and muscle damage is caused by muscle fibers tearing themselves apart during exercise. Neither of those two statements are really true. So basically, post-workout fatigue is a collection of 4 or 5 separate mechanisms, and they all trace back to biochemical processes that occur during a workout in relation to calcium ion accumulation. So the reason we talk about calcium ions is because when you activate a muscle fiber, if you activate it electrically from the central nervous system, then what happens is the electrical signal travels along the cell membrane, goes down inside the transverse tubule, and triggers the release of calcium ions into the fiber. So you're basically converting electrical signals into chemical signals to make the fiber do the cross-bridge formations that produce force. So it's kind of like a communication process. The issue is the calcium ions, when they enter the muscle fiber, they don't just tell the actins and myosins to bind with each other to produce force. They also trigger a whole bunch of other processes which create fatigue. And so I kind of call these calcium ion related fatigue mechanisms. Now, during the exercise, what you're going to have is a couple of calcium ion related fatigue mechanisms, one of which is called excitation contraction coupling failure, which is where the communication process breaks down. So you fragment the triadic junction, and the electrical signal arriving no longer produces a kind of a signal internally to produce cross-produce. And that's a little tiny damage mechanism, essentially. We call it excitation contraction coupling failure because it's a failure of the excitation contraction coupling process, but the reality is it's damage to a little protein that holds the junction in place. So we get this tiny damage mechanism. You can also get a little damage mechanism on the surface of the cell membrane. That's produced by when the mitochondria are dealing with calcium ions, they will produce reactive oxygen species, which trigger the release of a protease, which damages the cell membrane, and that then prevents electrical signals from transversing the muscle cell membrane. Now, interestingly, very quickly, a lot of the time when we see reductions in electromyography readings, it could be because of this cell membrane excitability reduction. So we've got to be careful when we kind of try to deduce what's happening from a sort of central nervous system point of view into what's happening on the muscular point of view, because you can get reductions in EMG signals because of this activation failure locally rather than centrally. So anyway, so you've got these mechanisms happening during the workout which are creating a reduction in muscle fiber force. Again, when you hit the post-workout period, the calcium ion accumulation has triggered the release of proteases which start damaging the myofibrils, and that's when you start to see what we would call as muscle damage happening. But that's happening in the post-workout period. That's not happening during exercise. When that protease damage starts to kind of settle down, you then have an inflammatory process which clears away all of that damage, creating essentially even more damage, in the sense that you've got to think of this inflammatory process as a clearing away process. I like to call it a Pac-Man process because the macrophages come in and just eat stuff. But basically, it's a clearing away process. So you're clearing away all the process, and then after that's happened, you're then going to start building new myofibrils. This is essentially the heart of the problem that I've been battling with some people on social media recently, where they've been trying to tell me that damage gets repaired before hypertrophy can happen. I'm like, well, we know that hypertrophy happens in day 1 after a single set exercise because myops comes down to baseline after like 29, 30 hours. But we also know that any damage that's happening is basically occurring in that first 12 to 24 hours. So damage can't actually occur before repair can't actually happen before hypertrophy is being processed, because the damage hasn't even happened at the point where the hypertrophy is already done. So, or at least not all of it. So what happens, you've got these two-phase process. Calpains, proteases causing damage to myofibrils, followed by secondarily, this inflammatory process. So what I've just done there very, very quickly is describe 3 key post-workout fatigue mechanisms all deriving from calcium ion accumulation. Firstly, you've got excitation, contraction, coupling failure. Secondly, you've got damage to the cell membrane, preventing conductibility of the action potentials. And thirdly, you've got the myofibrillar damage. So, very, very briefly, what's happening here is that the cell membrane excitability reduction and the excitation, contraction, coupling failure are switching the muscle fiber off internally. They're stopping you from actually creating cross bridges completely. The fiber just won't do anything. It won't produce a mechanical tension at all if you've created either of those two fatigue mechanisms.
What's the timeline? When do those fatigue mechanisms?
Excitation, contraction, coupling failure is happening inside of a workout. So if you do a set to failure with, and we'll get into rep ranges in a moment, but if you do a set to failure with a sort of a rep range that's kind of above 5, 6, 7-ish, you're going to have some excitation, contraction, coupling failure happening then. If you do a bunch of sets in that situation, you're going to start to see cell membrane damage as well. So it's slightly delayed in comparison.
And that's muscle specific, obviously.
That's fiber specific. That's muscle fiber specific because we're talking about individual fibers experiencing that issue.
But if you're doing full body and you take a set to failure with 10 repetitions and then you go to another
it's
muscle,
totally relevant. Yeah.
Then
yeah, exactly. And then thirdly, the third of the three mechanisms I've described is this muscle myofibrillar damage. And of course, that you could still be activating a fiber at that point, but you don't have as many myofibrils, therefore, because you damaged some of them. And the protease basically causes damage, but then the inflammation just clears it away completely. It takes the myofibril out. We talk about repair, and I've mentioned this a whole bunch of times, but we talk about repair, but it's not really repair, it's replacement. So you can't really think of the repair process as like you might, for example, if you've got a shelf that you need to repair in the house, you kind of look at it and you tinker about it and you fix the thing that's missing. That's not how repair processes work inside muscle fibers. The analogy in this situation would be you would take the old shelf down, remove it, throw it away and put a new one in place. It's a replacement process, not a repair process really. So that's our three key post-workout fatigue mechanisms that are happening inside the muscle fiber, and they're all going to be basically triggered initially by the calcium ion accumulation. Now, you can have, like you mentioned earlier, central nervous system fatigue. The reason that happens is because the inflammation that is creating this second wave of damage, I mentioned that earlier, the second wave of damage creates a secondary loss in strength. That inflammation gets into the bloodstream, creates a sensation in the brain, produces supraspinal CNS fatigue. Now that is going to be whole body because it's the brain level phenomenon. So what we've got here is three localized fatigue mechanisms, which are fiber specific, and a whole body CNS fatigue mechanism, which is going to affect everything. Now that is only going to kick in when the inflammation kicks in, which is going to be, 6 to 12 hours post-workout. Finally, if you really want completeness, you can also say, well, if I've got post-workout fatigue locally in a muscle, I'm also going to have a coordination disruption. Now, that's something for the athletes to worry about. That's not something for the bodybuilders to think about. So we've got these four mechanisms plus one if you want to think about it from an athletic perspective. Right. So that's the super quick version of post-workout fatigue in a nutshell. The reason I'm explaining this now from a repetition range point of view is that different rep ranges are going to create different amounts of calcium ion accumulation in the muscle fibers. So if you literally just do a couple of repetitions, you're not giving the muscle fibers enough time to accumulate calcium ions. It's literally that simple. So if I do singles, doubles, triples, then there's almost no calcium ion accumulation because I haven't actually activated the muscle fibers for long enough to allow calcium ions to accumulate. If I start doing higher repetitions, then you start to accumulate more and more calcium ions because you're activating muscle fibers for a longer period of time. That's it. So if you look across the entire rep range that we've described today, you go from single all the way up to 20, 30 repetitions per set. All you're doing is changing the amount of time that you're spending activating the muscle fiber and exposing it to calcium ions and allowing those calcium ions to accumulate. So if I do low repetitions, I don't allow that to happen. And if I do high repetitions, I do allow that to happen. So rep range is one of the key factors that determines how much post-workout fatigue mechanism you're going to generate. And as I've described earlier, all of them bottleneck through this calcium ion accumulation problem. So essentially, I think one of the biggest misconceptions in the frameworks that people use when they think about post-workout fatigue is they think, oh, well, I might have this mechanism, or I might have some CNS fatigue, or I might have some muscle damage. It doesn't work like that. Every single post-workout fatigue mechanism comes through calcium ion accumulation. So it's a package deal. You get all of them or you don't get any of them. So it's like you get the excitation, contraction, coupling failure, and if you've got that because you've accumulated calcium ions, you must also have, to some degree, some cell membrane damage. And if you've got that, you must also have some myofibrillar damage because you've created some proteases in response to the calcium ion accumulation.
Are the ways of training that would cause more, like you couldn't sort of cause more of one particular type compared to another?
Not at all, because it all bottlenecks through the same original phenomenon. It's actually, although when people listen to me talk about this stuff, they go, oh, wow, that's really complicated. I'm like, yeah, but just stick with it for 2 minutes, because when you get to the end of the explanation, what you realize is it actually is really simple, because it all coalesces into a single problem, which is if you are creating a lot of calcium ion accumulation during the workout, then you're going to create a lot of post-workout fatigue, all of the mechanisms. It's a package deal.
So a set of 20 being more fatiguing or causing fatigue to last longer than a set of 10, is that because there's more muscle fibers that are experiencing this excessive amounts of calcium ion accumulation then?
It's not that there's more muscle fibers, because if you train to failure, then you're probably seeing a very similar number of fibers being activated. It's the duration to which they're being activated.
But presumably training to failure is going to cause the muscle fibers of the highest threshold motor units to be active for a similar duration. So is it that there's other fibers that are active for longer, and that's
exactly. So you're continuing to the point where, because the easiest way to think about it is the other way around. So if you start with where your fatigue levels have to be at the end of the set in order to fail, that kind of helps. So if you're imagining, right, you've got a sort of a 15 rep max, and you think you've got a calculation that allows you to establish that that's approximately 70% of your 1 rep max. In other words, you've got to reduce your strength by 30% to get to the point where that 70% of 1 rep max is now impossible for you to lift. That's the process that you kind of got to go through. So like of that 30%, obviously there's going to be a chunk of central nervous system fatigue associated with the exercise that you've just done. There's going to be some metabolite related fatigue, and there's going to be some of this calcium ion related fatigue. Essentially what we're saying is that because of that larger percentage, because if I just do like a 5 rep max, which is 90%, then I've only got to drop strength by 10%. A big chunk of that is metabolites, a little bit of CNS fatigue, and I'm done. I mean, there's almost no calcium related fatigue at all. But if I push onwards and try and do 10 rep maxes and 15 rep maxes, and now I've got a 70%, and I've got to find that extra 20% of reduction in strength, a big chunk of that's going to come from calcium ion related fatigue. And the reason for that is because if you look at the individual fatigue mechanisms during a set, CNS fatigue, metabolite-related fatigue, and calcium-related fatigue, the metabolite-related fatigue is fastest. So if you're only doing a couple of reps, you get it all from metabolite-related fatigue. If you're doing a few more reps, you're going to get some from CNS fatigue as well. And if you do some more, you're going to get, and it sort of just works like that in the sense that the fewer repetitions you do, the more you're going to get from metabolite-related fatigue, and the less you're going to get from calcium-related.
I hope people follow that, because what you're saying is you can get to failure through different repetitions, and what's getting to failure is ultimately different types of fatigue.
The fatigue mechanisms vary depending on how long you're exercising for. So if you were to just literally measure everything from 1 rep max through to a marathon run, you can literally just see the change in fatigue mechanisms as you go through that sequence. So it's exactly the opposite way around from what most people think, literally the opposite. So if I look at a 1 rep max, what's the thing that causes me to experience fatigue in a 1 rep max? It's metabolites. It's nothing else. If I start to do doubles and triples as well as my singles, then I'm going to start to see a bit of CNS fatigue creeping in there, just a little bit. Start to do more repetitions, and you're going to start to see some calcium related fatigue creeping in there as well. If you push things right the way up through the rep range and you get all the way through the top end of the light loads and out the other side to the point where you've now no longer got any vascular occlusion happening. So now you can't accumulate metabolites, and you don't have metabolite-related fatigue. Now, what happens very interestingly is that the number of reps you can achieve suddenly skyrockets for a given percentage of 1 rep max. It skyrockets. You can now do loads more repetitions. And that then starts to change the thing completely. And ultimately, it pushes all of the fatigue now across to the central nervous system, because ultimately, you can always kind of just do one more repetition if you put your mind to it. And then you end up in this scenario where pretty much 50 to 70% of your actual fatigue you're experiencing is supraspinal in nature. So when we look at fatigue across the entire range of human activities, and there's almost no CNS fatigue in a heavy load 1 rep max, and there's pretty much exclusively CNS fatigue at the upper end of the spectrum.
So you could basically have like a bar, like a 100% bar, And
Yeah, you can.
whether you're
That's
doing
exactly what you
1,
can do.
5, 10, 20, you could have, X
Yeah.
percent is coming from this fatigue, X percent is coming from metabolites, calcium ion.
Exactly.
That would be, so failure is not failure. Like obviously what's leading to
failure is always the same thing. And this is, again, an argument I get into with people because they're like, oh, well, muscular failure is when the muscle can't produce enough force. I'm like, well, yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, technically, from the outside, it's going to look like that. But the reason you hit failure is because you reach the maximum tolerable perception of effort. You can see this happening. Like this very famous endurance runners, ultra endurance runners who can run for days and days and days and days. And they're basically, when you put one against the other, it's literally just a mind game. It's like who can psych the other one out? Because ultimately, you can always do one more step. There's nothing really stopping you doing more one step if you're motivated enough. If you increase the tolerable perception of effort, if you suffer pain to a greater extent, then you'll just be able to do that extra step. And so it becomes this really crazy situation where people can push themselves to absolutely insane limits. Now, you don't see that as visibly at the other end of the spectrum, but it's still there. It's just the magnitude of effect is much smaller, many orders of magnitude smaller, but it's still there. So ultimately, we're always hitting muscular failure, task failure, because of the maximum tolerable perception of effort. It's just much less visible at the high intensity end of the spectrum.
But the consequence, I guess, from a post-workout perspective is quite different. Now, you've given us timelines as to when these start to occur, but you haven't really touched on how do they differ in how long they persist for in terms of excitation, contraction, coupling failure, or myofibril repair or replacement. What's the difference in length?
So excitation, contraction, coupling failure seems to have a fairly tight boundary around it. I mean, I'm sure there are studies showing that it runs longer or shorter, but generally speaking, if we measure excitation, contraction, coupling failure after a workout, it usually sticks around for, say, somewhere between 2 and 4 days. 2 at the, obviously, sort of end of the spectrum where we're dealing with normal strength training, and you're going to push it up to maybe 4 days if you do a little bit of eccentric overload in there. The damage to the cell membrane is contentious. It really depends on what data you look at. If you look at data which has measured just the cell membrane excitability directly, it tends to go away quite quickly within probably about 6 hours. So it maybe isn't a post-workout fatigue mechanism that we need to worry about too much. But other data, indirect data, suggests that you could have sort of quite a permeable cell membrane for a couple of days post-workout. So in that case, it might fall in the same category as excitation, contraction, coupling failure. It doesn't really matter because the two are doing the same thing. So whether it's excitation, contraction, coupling failure, or both excitation, contraction, coupling failure and cell membrane damage, loss of sarcolemmal excitability, it doesn't really matter because they're doing the same thing. They're both switching off the fiber. You can't load a fiber that you can't switch on. Again, just let me emphasize this a moment when people say, oh, you worry too much about post-workout fatigue. No, I'm not worrying about post-workout fatigue. I'm worrying about being able to stimulate the fiber, and I can't stimulate the fiber if it can't switch it on. Post-workout muscle damage through the calpain process, the protease process followed by the inflammatory process, those are really interesting concepts because they literally expand and contract according to the magnitude of exposure to calcium ions. If you expose the muscle fibers to a very small amount of calcium ions, you're going to have a tiny amount of muscle damage. It's going to get cleared out within a day or two. You can push that process to silly extents. So obviously this is not done in human studies, but you can do it in animal studies and you can see 3 or 4 weeks worth of muscle damage. It takes that long to fix the problem. Generally doesn't take longer than that because what we have, again, a little bit of a terminology issue, but exercise scientists differentiate between muscle fiber repair and muscle fiber regeneration. Technically, and again, fitness industry doesn't do this, but exercise science does. So exercise science will say muscle fiber repair is when you keep the existing muscle fiber and you just replace bits of it that are damaged. Like the example I gave of the shelf, you take the shelf essentially down and you put a new shelf up. That's the repair process as it stands. Regeneration is where you would, like keeping the same analogy, you would knock the whole house down and build a new house. So regeneration is where basically the old fiber goes necrotic inside the cell membrane, completely dies, you clear it all away, it's absolutely completely gone apart from the cell membrane, and you completely build a new muscle fiber inside the old space, and that is regeneration. It complete and utter rebuilding of a fiber from the ground up, and the only thing you keep is the cell membrane. That's regeneration.
And the house comes back smaller in that scenario.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I don't actually know, and I don't think anybody has really done any work to establish what that would look like. You end up with a new muscle fiber inside the old cell membrane. How many myofibrils you end up with, I could not say, but you end up with a new cell membrane. A new fiber inside the old cell membrane. The reason I mention this is because regeneration tends to take about 4 or 5 weeks to happen. So in that scenario, we would say that we're highly unlikely to see repair processes push past that number of weeks, because if the fiber detects that the amount of damage is so catastrophic that it's going to take 4 or 5 weeks to do all of the repairing, then why bother? Makes no sense. Just regenerate the fiber and start again. And interestingly, I was looking at this yesterday because I was a little bit aggravated by people saying that muscle damage doesn't happen in trained lifters. I actually went and found a whole bunch of data showing regenerating muscle fibers inside powerlifters. So biopsies were taken of very high-level powerlifters, and you can actually see regenerating muscle fibers inside their muscles. Now, that's really interesting because basically that says you can get catastrophic level damage on a fiber-by-fiber basis in people who have high levels of voluntary activation, who are very well strength trained, large amounts of muscle mass, and perhaps their muscle fibers at the top end of their motor unit pool are being accessed. They're very fast twitch, very vulnerable to these calcium ion related fatigue mechanisms. You can get essentially regenerating fibers in those situations. So totally and utterly invalidates this idea that, trained people don't get muscle damage. I don't know where this idea comes from, but I see it all.
Now, I've got a couple of questions, and I want to stick with the fatigue before I ask you a more application-based question. But in terms of, you sort of when the fatigue mechanisms start, how long they're likely to last for, and that they're kind of all being driven by the same thing, by calcium ion accumulation. So we've sort of talked about different rep ranges influencing that. Do we want to touch on anything else that's influencing that as well?
I think it's worth mentioning, and just so that we've got a reference here. So basically there are, kind of 5 things, and I've done a bunch of articles on my FAQ to list these out. They're all available if people want to look into it in more detail. But essentially, rep range is just one of those 5. So obviously, proximity to failure is going to work more or less the same way as rep range. So if you start leaving reps in reserve, then you're going to dial things back a little bit. Now, the interesting thing here is that if you recall a moment ago, we were talking about how the different fatigue mechanisms have different appearances in time over the course of a strength training set. So if I do doubles or singles or even triples, basically because metabolite-related fatigue is so much faster in its appearance than the other fatigue mechanisms, I just end up with metabolite-related fatigue happening and nothing else. The same thing kind of happens if you start taking reps in reserve. So because calcium ion-related fatigue is back-ended in the set, I can really miss a lot of it by just leaving a rep or 2 in reserve. And I've pointed out to people that if they're doing moderate loads and they leave 2 reps in reserve, they can pretty much avoid the majority, if not all, of that calcium ion-related fatigue. If you're doing heavy loads, you probably only need to leave 1 rep in reserve. So I really, really like the kind of sort of 5 rep max with 1 rep in reserve, something like that. Doing 4 reps with a 5 rep max, I think is a brilliant sweet spot. Really, really does mitigate a lot of that problem. So proximity to failure is the first one I would look at. Volume, of course, obviously you do a whole string of sets, you can end up with more exposure of the muscle fibers to calcium ions because you're activating them for a longer period of time. So those are kind of like the 3 that I would say are duration driven. So essentially, volume, proximity to failure, and rep range, all you're saying here is how long are you activating these muscle fibers for? That's really all we're saying. The other 2 are caused by a different phenomenon. They're caused by stretch. So essentially, you've got the resistance profile, or how you're conducting the exercise, such that, are you activating the muscle fibers in the stretch position or not, basically. If you are, then you're going to have the opening of stretch-activated ion channels. That's going to cause accumulation of calcium ions through a different mechanism, and you're basically just going to turbocharge the problem that you've got. So I like to say to people, imagine doing something like, a couple of sets of heavy hip thrusts versus 1 set of high-rep squats. They're just completely and utterly different animals when it comes to post-workout fatigue, because you've got this kind of heavy load situation with your hip thrust where you've got a contracted position exercise. You're not going to get a lot of post-workout fatigue from that. Your high-rep set of squats, stretch position, high repetitions, again, you could modify that further and say, I leave a rep in reserve on the hip thrusts and I train to failure on the squats. There's literally a perfect kind of combination to see the difference in post-workout fatigue. So stretch, really big deal. And then, of course, just finalizing this, If you start messing around with the eccentric phase, either making it really long in duration or overloading it by using extra weight, you're going to end up with a lot more post-workout fatigue as well, because again, you're exposing a lot more fibers to stretch, or exposing those fibers to stretch and for a longer duration of time. So that's your 5 basic features. That's essentially the only things that are going to drive post-workout fatigue from a point of view of this set of calcium-related mechanisms.
So if you're doing a short position exercise, you think potentially you could do actually an extra set than what you would be doing?
Well, that's it. I mean, that's, historically, we've talked about this idea of volumizing at those kind of exercises. So, if somebody would say to me, look, I want to do more volume, then I'd be like, well, okay, well, pick exercises. Yeah, exactly. Pick exercises that have those contracted positions. And if you look at the leverage curves, you can generally find something that would work. Not always. I mean, you can't do that with a gastroc. It's not going to happen. But you can do it with many muscles. You can find a range of motion or a position or what have you that will advantage that muscle, but still keep it close to the contracted end.
So you've mentioned, people often say, oh, who cares if you're fatigued? It's not going to make that sort of difference. Or, fatigue may even help as far as hypertrophy. They're all kind of misconceptions. From an actual kind of outcome base, I know, it's hard to quantify some of this, but if you were to say, okay, if fatigue as being a measurable reduction, a temporary reduction in performance, we've got someone who is in this post-workout fatigue period where there is a couple % reduction in their performance capacity. What is actually happening that's going to negatively impact hypertrophy? Just so people are all clear why this matters.
So if we're talking about post-workout fatigue, which is today's kind of focus, then we're only talking about these sort of 4 or 5 post-workout fatigue mechanisms. So we've got cell membrane damage, excitation, contraction, coupling failure, myofibrillar damage, the CNS fatigue caused by the inflammatory process, and then, as I said, the 5th one is coordination disruption if you're an athlete and you need to worry about that. So ignoring the athletic one, we've got these 4 mechanisms. Excitation, contraction, coupling failure, and the cell membrane damage literally switch off the muscle fiber. So you can activate it and nothing will happen internally. So you're not getting cross-bridge formations, which means you're not getting mechanical tension, which means you're not going to be able to stimulate that fiber to grow. So if those mechanisms are present and you come back and train the muscle again, the fibers that are experiencing those fatigue mechanisms will just ignore you. Literally, they just don't even know that you're training because they're not being activated. Myofibrillar damage is a little bit of a grey area because if it's present, then you're reducing the number of myofibrils, reducing the number of cross bridges, you're reducing the amount of tension. So that's not actually switching the fiber off. It's just kind of reducing the amount of force production. Now, if you want to get really granular, you can say, well, there's other damage as well, and that's interfering with force transmission. Again, it's just the same thing. Just reduces the tension of the annoying one is the CNS fatigue because that's created by the inflammatory response and it's triggered by the brain perceiving the presence of that information. Now, the reason that's annoying is because it doesn't just affect the fibers that you've damaged, it affects the whole body. So if you've this is ultimately the issue with bro splits. So if you go in the gym and you smash a muscle to bits with your bro split training program and you come back the following day and you train a different muscle group, that inflammation that you've created in that previous day's workout is going to hamper your ability to hit high levels of recruitment in a completely different muscle the following day. And that's the annoying one because that's the one everyone ignores when they're putting programs.
And that's effectively, it's almost falling into the same category as the first 2 types of fatigue you were talking about because it's meaning you're not actually activating those muscle fibers. It
works the same way from the muscle's perspective in the sense that the 2 calcium-related fatigue mechanisms we mentioned, they switch the fibers off that are affected by that fatigue mechanism. The supraspinal fatigue effect does that same thing, but it does it to every muscle in the body the same way.
So you could smash your calves, and next day you go to biceps, and there's going to be a reduction in the amount of muscle fibers.
I wouldn't pick those 2 muscles as an example, really, because those are the ones that have. I mean, calves are not going to get that easily damaged, and biceps have got such a high voluntary activation.
Maybe we go the other way. Maybe we say biceps, and then come back the next day and do your calves.
That would be a much better example. Yeah, if you do an arm day and then you come back the following day and try and train another muscle group, you're not going to get the same level of recruitment that you would do if you'd had a day off the day before. So, and again, this is like very, very obvious mechanistic logic that we're using here. We're not, sort of just making stuff up. We're looking and saying, what is the stimulus for this adaptation? Well, it has to be activating the fiber and mechanically loading it. That's not contentious.
Yeah.
It's not contentious.
Yeah. So you said hypertrophy, I think you said this last week, if, we would remember one thing, it's hypertrophy is muscle fiber specific. And so in this situation, you're saying you're literally switching off the fiber. Like it cannot experience this mechanical tension. It cannot experience a stimulus for growth. Now, is there any way of quantifying, like, are we talking one fiber? Are we talking, like, how could you possibly get your head around what kind of practical impact that might have?
So generally speaking, you can extrapolate from the fact that muscle fibers produce very similar forces if they're of the same cross-sectional area. So muscle fiber type, a lot of people think that fiber type affects force production. It doesn't really that much. So you can have a slow-twitch fiber of a certain diameter and a fast-twitch fiber of the same diameter, and they'll produce very similar forces. 5-10% difference, really. Now, shortening velocity is a different animal. That's massively different. Again, athletic problem, not a bodybuilding problem. So that being said, if you have a post-workout fatigue reduction and you can measure that as a percentage change, then you can get a handle on how much of your muscle mass is being affected by fatigue mechanisms. Because ultimately, the fatigue mechanisms start at the most fast-twitch end of the spectrum and they work their way down. Because the more fast-twitch a fiber is, the less capable it is of handling calcium ions because of the mitochondrial content. So if you have a lot of mitochondria in a muscle fiber, it will just deal with calcium ions and not let them accumulate. If you don't have as much mitochondria, it won't let you do that, and you'll end up with accumulating calcium ions very quickly. So you can basically just say, well, this is my muscle, and I'm dividing it into like 100% worth of fibers. If I come back the following day and I've reduced strength by 30, 40, 50%, I mean, generally speaking, post-workout fatigue doesn't get much more than 50%. You can get worse than that, but that is specific populations of people that have a lot of fast-twitch fibers. You get back the following day, maybe you've dropped strength by 30%, which is a lot. That basically tells you that you've kind of lost access to about 30% of the muscle, more or less. Now, whether that's happened due to calcium-related fatigue locally or due to supraspinal fatigue, due to the inflammation response is difficult to ascertain. But you can kind of do it by maybe looking at non-local fatigue is a really, really nice one. If you say do like a really horrible knee extension workout with only one leg, and you come back the following day and you measure fatigue in both legs, and you've got like a 30% drop in strength in one leg and a 10% drop in strength in the other leg, that tells you you've got 10% of like a third of your post-workout fatigue is supraspinal and the other 2/3 is local, more or less. So I think that's one way you could do that. But basically, you're kind of saying that if you've got a 30% strength drop, then 30% of your muscle fibers are not really playing ball with you the following day.
Because I often hear people say, some of these fatigue studies, there's only a, 4%, 5% drop in performance. And it's like, well, what you've just said there is that's still going to be very significant if your goal is to maximize hypertrophy.
If you're an advanced lifter who's only really capable of growing the muscle fibers at the top end of the motor unit pool, and that could be your 4% that you're trying to train. I think, again, it's about saying what is actually happening. I've rambled on a lot today, so I don't want to ramble on too much more, but it just occurs to me that a lot of the time when I have disagreements with people on social media, they can't actually tell me how they think this stuff works. So I'm like, this is how my model works. I'm working through this logically. Here's the beginning, here's the end, and this is the reasons why I think it. And then the other person will be like, I disagree with you. I'm like, okay, well, how do you think it works then? Crickets. And it's like, well, no, come on. I mean, like, if you're putting yourself out there and you're trying to, take part in this discussion, at least tell me what you think is happening. And I don't get an answer. I'm like, well, I'm open to talking about this stuff, but I need to hear an opposing position, because I'm not going to throw my position out the window just because you don't like it if you can't give me something better. So I think that's ultimately where I'm always coming from. It's like, let's create a model, let's work it through logically, and let's figure out what we think is going on. And if there's bits wrong with it, let's try and fix that. But what I'm not going to do is throw the whole thing out the window just because somebody else doesn't like it, which is happening more and more recently. But it's like, well, give me an alternative then.
So this stuff is significant. Like, if your goal is to maximize growth, this really matters. And you can find, like, you've published, you've put out tables and stuff showing this stuff so people can see at what point are these fatigue mechanisms in place and how big are these reductions. Like, you can find this information relatively easily. So the last question I've got here is, we've talked about singles, doubles, triples, even fours. You can do many sets of these things. these are still stimulating hypertrophy. Like people who are aware of your model, they know that, well, ultimately those last 5 repetitions, give or take to failure, should all be maximally stimulating. They should all contribute to hypertrophy. If you're doing doubles, you're doing triples, you're stimulating hypertrophy. Does this mean we can just all go train with 10 sets of 2 and stimulate more growth than your conventional sets of 8, 2-3 sets of 8 to 12 kind of training program?
So physiologically, yes. Practically, it's not going to be very much fun. So, I think ultimately there are reasons why people don't do it. There are people out there who can absolutely do it, biomechanically suited to it. But I think, generally speaking, it's not a lot of fun to try and train like that. I think the sweet spot, as I say, is in that kind of 4 to 6 rep zone. I think that's probably the place where the weight is not creating other problems, but at the same time is also not creating a lot of post-workout fatigue. I think we've just got to, sort of look at the traditional moderate load rep range. Traditional. Obviously, we're looking at Reg Park here, and he's working with 3 to 5. And Sandow, obviously, they're probably lifting a lot heavier. But the issue is we've kind of got ourselves into this zone where we tend to use moderate loads, and I think we just need to correct downwards a notch. I'm not going to be the one who goes out there and tells people to lift with singles, doubles, and triples. I don't think it makes sense practically. But I do think working at the lower end of the moderate load rep range, if we say that's 6 to 15, I think working at the lower end of that, 6 and 7, is really going to make a big difference to a lot of people. It's going to be a lot easier to recover from the workouts they're doing. I like working in the 4 to 6 zone. I think it's a really nice sweet spot. I think just moving down from 6 to 4 is a huge shift in post-workout fatigue. But again, not everyone's going to tolerate that. Not everyone's going to want to do that. I think it's going to come down to that balance between what people feel comfortable doing and safe and, not getting soft tissue discomfort, but at the same time managing that post-workout fatigue. And everyone's going to have an individual sweet spot, I think, for that. But generally, I would say if you've got a moderate load rep range of 6 to 15 and you start moving from the top end of that down to the bottom end of that, I think that will make a big difference to people post-workout fatigue. And I don't think that's too heavy for the majority of situations.
A couple of thoughts I have on it. I'm interested to hear if you think anything differently about this. So I do program low repetition sets for my hypertrophy clients. And again, at the start of this podcast, I said I love that combination of Steve and Reg's program. And one of my favorite ways to train is actually to alternate those two. So I do one day of single set work, and that'll usually be in that sort of 8 to 10 repetition range, sometimes even higher because, again, based on weight availability of the machine or whatever, I'll just use a stack and just do AMRAP or whatever, but I'm doing single sets. And then on the alternate day, I tend to do sort of like a 3x5 or, 4 to 5, whatever. And what I find with that is obviously your ability to use as many exercise variations in that second heavier workout, that's going to be limited because, multi-sets is going to be a very long workout. But obviously, if you're using more compound lifts, if you're training at home or whatever, that's going to be a very effective workout. Now, when I am programming this stuff for clients, a couple of points to make. So firstly, if we are using, say, sub 5 repetitions, we don't need to be using, if you're doing doubles or triples, you don't need to be using a 2-3 repetition max. Like you can be using a 5 rep max. So, a lot of the criticism here is, if I'm doing doubles, triples, it's so heavy, I need to load it so much. Well, no, you need to load it the same as you would load a set of. So from a loading perspective, it's not any more difficult.
Exactly, because ultimately a 5 rep max is going to be stimulating on the first rep. So you can absolutely just do a bunch of 5 rep maxes as singles or doubles. And I think that's probably the most elegant way of addressing the problem.
So then the other thing is that obviously allows you to volumize like you're talking about before. So if you did have a priority muscle, priority lift or whatever, you could do 5, 6, 7, 8 sets, whatever, with that 5 rep max, but you're doing doubles and triples and you can effectively get more stimulating volume in that workout than you would otherwise. Again, a limitation here, if people listen to me say that and think, I'm going to go do that for every exercise, well, you can only do it for so many exercises. Otherwise, you'll be doing 60 sets in a workout, right? So time is going to be a limitation, but either you could pick 4, 5, 6 exercises and do that within a single session and then have your longer session, 20 different exercises, whatever, in the other day, or, and what I often program is 1 or 2 exercises in a session where we do this, and then we do all our other exercises as single sets. So that's where I'm using it. And then the other thing I'm using it for is exercises where I say something like a squat, a hack squat, a pendulum squat, if I simply, or something that's, easily damageable, very, very sort of cardiovascular demanding as well. Like if I'm doing a pendulum squat and I'm doing a set of 10, that is just going to kind of ruin that session for me. Like I'm going to need to wait, 10 minutes before that's not going to be affecting my next set. So for me, I would prefer to load that pendulum squat super heavy, do, 5 rep max, do doubles with it. I get my 3-4 sets out of doubles. And that's going to take much less of a toll and impact the rest of my workout a hell of a lot less if I'm doing 1 or 2 sets of 10.
Totally. I think, yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of creative ways to work with this information. It definitely starts to go off the top end of what I'm kind of focused on though. So it's like, I could listen to you talk about this stuff and I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And like my brain is just wandering thinking about calcium ions. It's just like, I think again, I'm always interested. I'm always kind of curious to see how this model gets implemented, and it's really cool to see the different solutions that you come up with and that other people come up with. But it's really not something that I think I'm ever going to really try and do. It's just not my wheelhouse.
I know, I've been talking about this for years. It's difficult to
explain to people that I'm trying to solve the problem of the physiology, and people try and put me in their box. I get this in my Instagram questions, actually. I do an Instagram questions every Saturday, and a lot of the questions I get, or many of the questions I get, tend to assume that, well, I feel like they're putting me in a box with other people that they recognize doing similar things. And they go, oh, well, you're like this person or you're like this person. I'm like, well, I'm really not, because pretty much every person you got on that list is selling a training program, and pretty much everybody is trying to get you to train in a particular way that they think is right. And I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to teach you a physiological model that explains how all of this stuff works. So I'm not in that box. I'm in a different box. And yes, I can interact with people that are doing those things, and I do enjoy doing that. But ultimately, their creativity is around the program design side of things. My creativity is trying to figure out how this stuff works on a physiological level. So, I'm always going to just kind of be a little bit behind the curve when it comes to program design, that kind of thing. It doesn't light me up the way that it lights other people up.
I think it's helpful nonetheless to come to you and be like, does this make sense physiologically? And we're not,
I'm not saying that's what I'm
exactly. And I'm not saying that what I've just suggested are the only ways to do things.
Exactly.
Obviously, like you've said, the model can be applied in ways we haven't discussed. And that's sort of out there for people to think about and creatively engage with and utilize. So at no point are we trying to put a limitation on it and say it has to be used in this way.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people are surprised when they send me a program or a workout, and they go, is this going to work? And I'm like, yeah, probably. And I think they expect me to go, no, you should not do it like this. You should do it like this way that I have said is the only possible way you can do it, because they see other people doing that, because everyone's got their own little pet programs that they want to kind of advance. I'm like, well, no, I think it would solve the problem. And you can have better and worse kind of solutions, and you can have more creative and less creative solutions. But ultimately, from my perspective, I can tell you physiologically what's going on, and then whether there might be ways you could change it in a given direction to make it better. But ultimately, I'm not going to be standing there going, no, you must program like this or you must program like that. I will say to people that if their program has a very low frequency of training each muscle, that they're losing out by doing that, and that's a choice that I wouldn't make. But I'll equally be able to tell them whether I think the net hypertrophy over the week is going to exist or not based on the data that we've got. Anyway, we're kind of a long way away from the purpose of this podcast at this point.
We are, but hopefully people find it helpful and interesting. And the final point I want to make on that is why I find this conversation so helpful, because again, like you said, it's not something that lights you up, but I still force you to talk about this stuff with me all the time, because I remember talking to someone once and they were a muso, and they said, if someone asked me to write a song, I'd be like, where the hell do I start? What kind of song? But if they say, I want a song about this or like this in this time signature or whatever, and they give them some guideline, then they're like, oh man, I've got so many ideas. And that's how this works for me when I think about programming. It's like, well, actually having these conversations with you over time has just expanded the possibilities. And it's like, wow, there's so many creative ways to use this model, take it, apply it, shape it, and come up with new ways of doing training that make sense, as opposed to just not even knowing where to start.
I think that's a really nice way of putting it, and I hope that, and I would be very happy if people were to do that. I mean, I think, the model is not designed to be constrictive; it's designed to be a facilitator. It's as you say, it's designed to facilitate, saying, look, anything that you do that fulfills these criteria will work. And that hopefully is liberating rather than being constricting. I think a lot of people. I mean, I get this criticism. People say, oh, Chris just says you've got to train in this way, otherwise it won't work. I literally see that being said all the time. And I've never said anything like that at all. You're not listening to what I'm saying. I'm saying this is how the physiology works. If you can't figure out a way of training programming within that framework, then I'm sorry, that's not my problem. That's a lack of imagination, because I think the problem is actually the framework is actually really clear. But anyway, that's a complaint. I'm just complaining at this point, so stop me talking. And that's
okay. We're done. Thank you guys for tuning in, sticking with us for our rambling. Hopefully you enjoyed the episode, and hopefully you'll join us again for another episode.